looking up at the blast doors, we tried to find a way to get through. There was a small console on the side, which we tried the key cards with, but since the console itself didn't have any power, we didn't think anything of it. There was no beeps, no lights, no anything. The console was non-functional. However, we knew that if these are blast doors, that meant that was some sort of bunker. That means there's supplies inside, supplies we're going to need. But for right now, we could just stare at the damn thing. Then we heard again. But there was more than one. Before I even got to turn around, we could hear everybody say, "We got to get out of here. Something's in here." Those of us with weapons set up a perimeter and we began walking. I slowly told everybody, "Hey, stay. If you're not carrying a weapon, stay in the middle. Everybody else, eyes up, everywhere." As we made our way back to the ground floor, we heard even more of that crawling and skittering. We couldn't figure out where the hell it was. Where was it? Where was it? What was it? And then everything went quiet. Dead still. No bugs anymore made any sounds. None of the birds on the outside chirped. It was just silent. I motioned for everyone to stop and stay still, but most of them had never had any military experience, so they didn't know the hand signals I was giving. So I had to tell them, "Shh, stop, don't move." The skittering had stopped too. And then we heard several boom, boom, boom. It's like something big was hitting the ground really hard. We couldn't figure out what it might be, but something had got the local wildlife all scared, and I could sense something was around. My senses had been hiked up to 1,000 at this point. I couldn't figure out how, but it did. Others were also twitching. Those who also had long ears like mine now started twitching their ears as a sign of nervousness. I motioned for them to come and follow slowly as we headed towards the front door. Boom! Something crashed outside. We couldn't figure out what it was, but we stopped short of the door and we looked out. And something was coming through the trees. The booms we heard was something knocking over trees and they were hitting the ground. We could now hear trees being cracked like tree limbs as this thing moved through. Something was shaking the land and we didn't know what it was. But something big was out there. Another tree crackled and fell. Boom, hitting the ground. What the hell was strong enough to knock over a big old maple like that? That's all I could think, but we were all dead silent, waiting to see if this thing would pass us. We could hear it walking away, the trees cracking slowly as it moved. We began to breathe a sigh of relief. And then a scream ripped out from behind us. I spun around, and our man in the back was being dragged away by something. We couldn't figure out what, but this thing had long legs and had speared our friend as he screamed for help as he was going away. He was whipping his weapon around left and right, but his blade was not connecting with anything. I took aim with a rifle and I fired into the face of this thing. It let go of him and screeched as loud as it could and then started thrashing all over the ground. We reached up, grabbed our wounded compatriot, and tried to get to the doorway. We backed up towards the doorway, and we could see these things, whatever in the hell they were. They looked like almost like giant spiders, but not really. They only had 6 legs. They did still walk like spiders, but they were multiple segmented, several like 8, 9, 10 segments as they came up. Each one had long spikes out the front like you would consider a spider, but they didn't have the spikes in the back like you would think of a centipede. Their mandibles were massive, and you could see that as the one started to flinch on the ground, the other ones got closer to it, but they weren't trying to save it. Instead, they grabbed it and started ripping it to pieces and started eating. Out of reflex, I took aim and fired at each one. Contagious gunfire erupted as each one of these massive centipede-looking spider, whatever the hell they were, started thrashing around. And then we realized, something is even worse. We spun around, and that thing had come out of the forest and was looking right through the doorway at us. This monster looked like a massive troll of some sort. Its long nose, long jaw was staring at us through its 4 eyes. Its arms so long they almost scraped on the ground. Its stout legs just stood there, looking at us. It stared for a moment, and then it began to move. It got down on all fours and began to trot at us. On its knuckles and on its heels, it came at us like a massive gorilla. We tried to back in, but we realized we were boxed in between this massive creature and these centipede, whatever in the hell they were. All of a sudden, I just turned, and as I did, I heard one of the guys say, "Run!" as we bolted towards the door that led us back to the basement. We ran towards the door as best we could, dragging our wounded comrade behind us. As we finally reached the door, this massive creature had reached the building. It reached in and missed us, but grabbed the centipede creatures, and as they thrashed around his hand, they bit at him, and it simply raised it up and shoved them into his mouth. And with several disgusting crunches, you could hear it crunching it in his mouth and swallow. And then it looked at us as we started getting inside the door, and it reached for us again, but we were already inside and slammed the door shut. We scrambled down the stairs and headed towards the blast door as best we could. We figured since it had concrete walls, it was the safest place in the building. The creature outside began to rip the building apart around us. The top floor was torn off. We could feel the whole building shake and shimmer as the building itself was being removed. We could hear this thing beating on the ceiling above us. It must have been using its large hands to hammer down to try and get through the concrete floor. We sat on the ground trying to hold our friend's wound shut as he cried in pain and we cried in fear. Those of us with weapons turned our weapons towards the roof of what we could think, what the hell were these pitty little pop guns going to do against this, whatever in the hell that was. Bam, bam. The thing kept beating on the concrete more and more and more as we could hear the building being ripped apart. We could hear parts being tossed and landing somewhere else. It still shook the foundation. For 3 minutes at least, it continued to beat on the floor and rip the building apart, stopping every once in a while, and we could hear these screams, these unintelligible screams, these high-pitched wails as it clearly found something else to eat inside the building. These were not human screams. These were the screams of those whatever in the hell type of giant bugs those were. And it only paused for a moment before it began to beat on the ground again. And then suddenly, there was silence. We all stood there, waiting, listening. Was it gone? Was it playing possum? What could have happened? Shh. Don't move. Don't move. I kept telling people. Listen. And we could hear it start to move. As large as it was, it couldn't hide the impacts from its feet from that close. We might not have heard it through the woods, but there was nothing cushioning its footfalls now as it started to walk away. I took a deep breath as I took my finger off the trigger and put the safety back on. I turned to our wounded friend. "Can you walk?" He just shook his head up and down, and we began to move towards the stairs. Opening the door, we realized that the stairs had been completely removed. The only way up was to climb up the debris. With a wounded friend, that was not quite possible, but maybe there was another set of stairs. And then suddenly, I heard Bill say, "Oh God, the house! The house!" Simultaneously, everyone said, "Oh shit," and we all began to climb. One of our compatriots stayed with our wounded, and the rest of us clambered up the debris, trying to climb out of the building as fast as possible. We didn't even have to get to the top to know the building was gone, as sunlight screamed out to us, almost blinding us as we got closer to the top. As we did, we realized the building was down to its foundation. This creature had actually removed all top 2 floors. The only thing left was the basement level. We looked over, and sure enough, that thing was heading straight for the house. Slowly and methodically it walked. What the hell do we do? This is when we simply started running. We are to protect and provide. That is what we do. And we ran towards it. I held the weapon in my hand. All I could think of is, what can this thing possibly do? We ran as fast as we could. For its size, it was amazingly slow on only 2 legs, and we caught up fairly quickly. As we got towards its back, it must not have heard us coming. I lined up and began to fire shots into the back of its head, but this seemed to only annoy it, but it did get its attention. It turned and looked down at us as we all held our weapons up. 2 rifles, 3 pistols, and a simple homemade bow and arrow. What the hell were we thinking? It turned and seemed to grin at us. That was enough that I could actually smell that one of our men had pissed his pants out of fear. This troll thing began to hammer over to us, moving its feet slowly and methodically, realizing that if we ran, we would just die tired as this thing threw us down its gullet. I aimed as best I could, aimed right towards its innermost right eye. As it got within a few hundred feet, I squeezed around, and suddenly the thing backed off, holding its face in pain. I just screamed, "I knew it!" And everyone else began to fire at the creature's face. Several of the bullets ended up in its mouth, and the soft flesh inside could not stop the impact. The skin and its thick bones could take the impact, but the bullets could still pierce the softer parts. It covered its face and its mouth. It turned, and keeping one hand over its face, it trotted away on 3, both legs and its free arm. As it ran away, some of the men were screaming, "Yes, yes," and so happy that we had fought this thing off, that we had survived. But I wasn't happy. I looked at my weapon. I was out. An entire magazine went in, and I didn't have any more. This hunk of metal was nothing more than a club to me now. I looked at the others, and sure enough, all but one of us was out. The only one that wasn't was holding a pistol, and I could see that he had malfunctioned his weapon. We ran to the house as fast as we could to get the females. We knew that they had seen this creature, and so when we got to the house, we were greeted with an empty house. We looked around, scared. Everyone says, "Where are they? Where are they?" I said, "Search the place." I didn't have to tell them to do that. Everyone started going around. I started freaking out, looking for anything, bodies, blood, personnel. We were screaming out, "Are you here? Are you here? Sound off, are you here? Tell me something." And we looked, we couldn't find them. We ran outside the house screaming, "Where are you? Where are you?" And then we realized, wait, there are fresh tracks here. Look, our Lamia friend leaves a big trail. They went back to the facility. Without skipping a beat, we all ran towards it as fast as we possibly could, and thankfully we saw the females waiting just inside the blast door. We went inside and told them what happened. They were so grateful that we were still alive, but we said that one of ours was injured and we needed to get them out. We headed off in that direction after making a makeshift litter, and we were able to get him out of the lower levels. Thankfully, it was a little easier as we found the second staircase that the creature, whatever the hell it was, had left in one piece. Unfortunately, the wounds were not as deep as we thought. They were more superficial than anything. However, he would be on his back for a few days. We realized that the house was not damaged by weather. Looking back up at the roof, we could see that this thing had actually taken handfuls of the roof off. With that thing around, we knew it was too dangerous to stay out in the open. We had to find a new place. But there was only one place we knew that was able to keep us safe. So back to the facility we went. We stayed inside there for the next couple of days. Resources became very strained, and some of us had to go out to try and hunt, but there wasn't much of anything to hunt. Those new creatures that we found had changed the entire biosphere of the planet, at least anything around us. That big monster had clearly eaten anything of size, and those little giant centipedes, whatever the hell they were, they had taken out anything else that was smaller. I wondered, was there a river around? Maybe we could get some fish or something. We found berries, of course. It was sparse as they were not in season, but we did find something. An old farm down the street did have some that we could forage off of, fruit trees and that sort of thing. However, things were definitely not in season. But at that point, food is food. The river provided us with a few fish, thankfully, which satiated more of the meat eaters. Our Lamia friend, even though her mind was out, was simply a carnivore. She could not digest any type of plant matter, not without getting a bad case of the runs. And you don't want to see a Lamia with a case of the shits. It's messy. Speaking of messy is when we went back to the pods to see what was due and what was going to come out. When we responded to the cries from down the hall, we heard screaming, what is this shit? Oh, get it off of me. We ran down and we saw in one of the rooms several of the pods had opened and several more had come out. However, not all of them seemed friendly. As we rushed in the first room, we could see something with 4 legs kicking on the ground as it was covered with that sludge, and yet another creature on the far end was trying to open up massive wings that we could see as it tried to flick off that same sludge. We looked over and realized that the one with 4 limbs had a human-ish face, so we went to it first. Of course, it was closer, and we asked her, "You okay?" And it simply began to cry like some little child. The Lamia that was with us began to cry as well. We couldn't figure out what the hell was going on, and I looked at the pod and realized that it was that young child from when I was first put in, the one whose mother was trying to comfort it. I went and wiped their face off as they spit the goo out, because obviously it did not taste good. They opened their eyes and began to freak out and tried to back up, and then realized that they had more limbs now than when they went in with. I looked and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This young girl was a centaur now. Okay, we'll deal with that later. As a massive scream of something came from the other end of the room, that thing with wings started thrashing around as it wiped its face on the ground, this thing clearly not having any humanity left in it, as it looked at us and growled and screamed and then charged at us. We grabbed what weapons we could and then charged at it, but it was coming at us too fast. It ran into us and grabbed one of the men and took off down the hallway with the man in its maw. We could hear screaming as I'm sure he was fighting it off. But I know he didn't make it. As we chased down, we could see massive amounts of red all over the floor, all over the walls. And we could hear from down the hall as this thing was thrashing around, and the screams the man let out and the curses had already faded away. We barely saw it as we reached the blast doors, as it flexed its wings, shook off a little more of the goo, and then took to the sky. We all responded, "What the hell was that? Since when did they make dragons?" But with everything that had happened, who were we to judge? Soon enough, we went back to each of the rooms that had pods of everyone coming out. We found, of course, the young centaur still crying. The Lamia tried to comfort her, but turns out the centaur was afraid of snakes. I went to her and I tried to do something, but I'm not a counselor. Thankfully, some of the females helped. It wasn't until later that we realized that several other of the pods had opened and more things that were once human were no longer human, were loose in the facility. We grabbed whatever weapons we could to make sure they stayed back, but holy hell, some of these things are just what the hell. You had a giant butterfly moth hybrid with human arms and legs as it tried to fly its way down the hallway, but its massive wings, now unfurled, couldn't actually open the entire way as it thrashed around, aiming towards the light of day. But as it went to the light of day, it simply climbed up the side of the facility, folded its wings down, and waited. I guess it was enough moth in it. However, there were others. Many others now. We didn't realize the pods would open as fast as they did, but now they were just popping open left and right. By the time we got one cleaned off, 2 more would open up again. What is going on? How many more are there? Well, as it turns out of the 5 different areas that had pods in them, one area was completely abandoned, didn't have any. So that left approximately 400 at most. However, we counted up that at least half of them did not even make it to be released. Well, 48%, but 50 is close enough. Those that did hatch out of their pods, it was calculated that approximately 12% of them came out with creatures that did not have any intelligence, humanity left in them, but ran on pure instinct. These were the dangerous ones who came out. Another almost 10% came out with limited intelligence and would simply think about what was food and then take it as food. This is what had happened to that ogre-looking bastard who tried to kill me when I first came out. We had a few more of those, and we realized we could not stay in the facility. It was getting too dangerous. When the last pod finally opened, we counted up how many people we had. Well, I shouldn't say people. At least, not all of us, mind you. As it turns out, there was well over 100 of us, which is a lot of mouths to feed, which put such a strain on a resource collection it became a daily occurrence just to survive. We knew we couldn't stay here. Everyone knew it. Even the youngest realized that there was not enough to collect around to survive off of, and we couldn't get through the blast doors. So it was decided that we would move everyone outside and risk being taken by that monster that was still out there. However, there were others. More monsters had broken free from the facility that we were in. There was dragons, moth-type people. It was all sorts of craziness. Insectoids, too. Oddly enough, a few of them seemed to still have their ability to think. Yet, when they came out, it's like they all came out at once as we watched as 5 of these, I don't know how else to put it, but they had insectoid bases, and yet their torso was mostly human. Their arms seemed to have a chitinous covering on them. Their shoulders did. Their backs, it looked like armor with the plates that cover themselves. They still had semi-human faces. Many had multiple eyes. However, they still moved around on multiple limbs. One seemed to be an outlier, as it had multiple limbs, but they were all human legs that were distorted with multiple joints. All the rest skittered as they went across the hard metal floor, and this one stomped as though 30 people were crashing through. The rhythmic step of it was actually what tipped us off that they were coming down the hallway. If not for that, we would have been right in their way as they went towards the front door. And then they just disappeared. We were grateful that they left and didn't try to make us their lunch. However, we still had to leave. When the last pod had opened, I received another shock as another blue-skinned like me had come out. That made 3 of us. I was surprised at everything since we had a very eclectic coloring here now. We had standard human colors. We had blue, green, red, and in one case purple, which surprised the hell out of everybody. That dark, dark purple that came out. We thought something was wrong with her. However, she just liked the fact that she filled out more, which is what she went in for in the first place. When we decided to leave, we all left as a group, carrying as much supplies as possible. With our makeshift weapons, we began to move around. We followed the road as best we could as we went past the main facility that was now nothing more than debris with a couple of openings down to the basement level. We continued going down the road as we found the parking garage again. The cars were again searched, but there was still not much to be found. Then we finally got to the far end, to the crossroads, and we had to decide which way. It wasn't much of a choice. We could see the footprints from that troll turning to the right, so we turned left and went down the roads until we found another crossroad which crossed a bridge, and then we figured, oh well, I guess we'll see where this leads. Where it led made us all stop. It was another facility just like the one we had left the day prior. How could there be 2? We never heard that there was a second one. We got a little closer and we realized that the road that went past the main facility, if you went around back, it would have actually led to this other facility. We went inside, looked around, but it looked like it had been decommissioned a long time ago. The few pods that we found inside this facility looked ancient in comparison to the ones we were using. Somebody said this must have been the alpha site. All the pods were open, all the pods were empty. So we began to search. The young one stayed behind as we looked through. And as we did, we realized that we could find more information that was here. I couldn't make sense of the genetic codes. A few people could, but it's not something I learned to read. What I did find was ammo, and a lot more than I expected. As it turns out, this place had an entire stocked armory. I gave everyone who knew how to use a weapon, and then we loaded up as much with the ammo as we could and still keep walking. We decided to stay there tonight as we searched through. However, I insisted, along with others, that we stay inside the pod room as it seems to be the most secure area in the facility. And with that thing still walking around out there, along with God knows what else is hatched out of those fucking pods, we need to be safe about things. Everyone agreed, although they weren't too keen about laying on blankets on top of the hard steel floor. However, it was what had to be done, and they knew it. Our next surprise is when we went downstairs. To our shock, as I got to the base of the stairs, all I heard is, "I found another one!" I turned the corner, and sure enough, there was another blast door, one of these massive blast doors. What the hell? They must all be interconnected somehow. I looked over and said, "Hey, did you bring those key cards?" "Oh, sure did." He reached into his bag, pulled them out, and started flashing them 2, 3, 4 at a time. But again, nothing happened. No beeps, no clicks, no nothing. We sighed. Well, at least we tried. Keep searching. We don't have anything to cut through it. We don't have anything strong enough to rip it out. And we looked around. Sure enough, we found another cafeteria, which thankfully still had many preserves left, and many of the folks were glad to finally have a full belly for a change. However, those that were completely carnivorous were kind of SOL until we found entire cans full of canned meat. We had to surrender those over, and it was a vegetarian meal for the rest of us. However, we did find out that our centaur friend could only eat vegetables along with a few others. However, that did not stop us from enjoying the little bit of happiness that we could. That night I remember staying by the door. I wasn't the one on fire watch that night. However, I was also one of the only ones that had military experience. And if something came in, I wanted to be able to face it before it touched the others. That night was quiet. Very, very quiet. Almost too quiet. Why don't I hear bugs? I shot up from my sleep. I was like, what? Okay, why am I awake? Gripping my rifle tightly, I looked around as best I could. As I did, I could hear something moving around. I simply said, "Who is it?" "Hey man, it's just me. I'm on guard tonight." Dude, you are freaking me out with that. You jumped up like something was wrong. With that, his voice was cut off, and something hit the ground. I couldn't figure out what it was. I flipped on the flashlight at the end of my rifle, and something was on top of him. Something with about 7 or 8 type of crushing legs, crushing limbs, holding onto him. He couldn't get anything out because it was pressed across his face and went down his body. Some sort of eel-looking something or other with long, heavy legs as it began to crush him. I flipped over to the side, trying not to put the bullets through it, and into my friend, I slid sideways, flipping off the safety, and began to fire into this thing through the side. It didn't even flinch, but the sound made everyone jump to their feet as they didn't know what was going on. Most of them covered their ears from the sound of the fire coming out in an enclosed area. The sound was deafening. My ears were ringing as I began to fire up its body, up more, until I finally got to the head, and then it just slumped. With that, I grabbed a hold of it from the side and pushed it over. I was like, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" Billy desperately trying to get his voice back. I don't know. Oh, that hurt. Ow. I looked, and this thing had pierced him down just below the collarbone. 2 piercing marks were there. I tried to get him up and tried to stop the bleeding, but he wasn't bleeding all that much. The puncture wounds were not that hard or not that deep. However, they did still pierce his skin. I looked over at this thing I had just shot, and sure enough, there were 2 small spikes coming out. I looked closer, and these turned out to be fangs. I looked closer, and this thing was more snake-like than I thought. However, with those long appendages almost coming out, I don't know how else to describe it except multi-jointed, very thick, and ending at the bottom like elephant feet. These things would wrap around and were beginning to crush him. Thankfully, nothing was seriously wrong as far as the bones were. He was just having trouble breathing. I walked over and looked at this thing. One of the others came over, turned out to be a scientist back in the day, grabbed a hold of one of the fangs, squeezed the base, saw something drip out. They moved their hand up and sniffed it. I don't know what type of toxin that is. If it was hemotoxin, he'd be dead already. Any guesses? Probably a nerve agent. We watched our friend for a while as he slowly faded in and out of consciousness. We had to smack him awake a few times, throw cold water on him, anything to keep him awake. But this time, no one would sleep. Our ears were all ringing for at least an hour as we tried to keep our friend alive. Thankfully, we succeeded, but he was not feeling good for several days. The red skin went pale as he was trying to fight off whatever it was. This thing's venom was akin to a rattlesnake, as it turns out. It wasn't meant to kill you, just paralyze you long enough for them to come and get you. However, this thing apparently was smart enough to realize not to dump all the toxin in. If it had, I would have watched my friend die that night. However, after 2 days, he was able to stand. Maybe nauseous and not able to move fast, but he could stand. I realized we couldn't stay here, and everyone realized it as well. So we went to walk again. We kept going outside the facility. We followed the roads around, and we come to find out that this road was actually a giant loop. The way that giant troll had left is the only road that leads out of this valley. Now what do we do? The answer is simple. We just keep going. However, we did see something on the horizon we were not expecting to see. Smoke. At the time, we worried that there was a fire, a forest fire. We were going to end up having to fight just to survive, but then we started looking closer. There were 2 or 3 different spots where the smoke was coming out. I remember looking and saying, I think somebody's making a shitty fire. A few of the other people who had been camping laughed, and everyone else was confused, as we knew that using the wrong type of wood, you end up with a huge smoke trail. However, if there was fire, there was people. If there was people, there was resources. If there was resources, we can survive. So we started our long walk over towards them. It was on the far side of the valley where we passed even more and more buildings. We didn't realize how big this research facility truly was until we realized how many of these large buildings there were. We would have to come back and check them later. And we finally got close enough to the fire where we could smell the smoke. And we looked and we couldn't believe what we saw. There were huts and hooches, stone buildings, surrounded by a wall a good 30 feet high with spikes all over it. Clearly, this was to keep that ogre freaking troll thing out. But what amazed us is we looked on the top of the wall. Were those creatures like us?